violence in Bacon's pictures calls forth equally violent reactions.
To encounter the art of Francis Bacon is to cede our preconceived notions of how one should interact with a painting, for his canvases demand the viewer to corporeally feel the paint rather than admire it through the optics of vision. This visceral confrontation is initiated by the three most simple yet fundamental aspects of Bacon's paintings: the figure, the surrounding fields of color, and a contour that separates the two. Taken together, these three form a system that isolates the figure, in turn emphasizing the fleshiness of the body in relation to its surroundings. The stark contrast between the solid fields of vivid color and the mangled blobs of often indistinguishable yet palpable fleshy bits make the raw materialism of the body radically apparent. While Bacon's work is often categorized as figurative, the isolation of his figures resists this label, for the figurative has been historically depicted, often forms a part of a larger narrative structure used to tell a story. By isolating his figures, Bacon annuls any possibility to narrativize the bodies depicted, in turn subverting the reduction of painting itself to mere mimetic narrative. His figures are not depictions of real life or portraits, nor are they used as narrative, but rather emphasize the figures-based materialism. Implementing Georges Bataille's concept of the formless, Bacon seeks to dismantle the figure from its elevated status as symbolic. In turn, his fragmented, fleshy bodies in a state of perpetual violence are located in a debased state, knocking off both art and the figure from its metaphorical pedestal, and back into the gutter of the corporeal and the material. While the term figural often connotes or preimposes a status of familiarity, the spectre of Bacon is not presented with a figure that is recognizable or anatomically correct, but rather confronted with the violence of a raw materiality, the flesh itself, stripped of subjectivity. Not only is presented in a violent tension within the figure's own space, but also imposes its violence onto the viewer, who is confronted with the debased inherent in her meaty embodiments. Bacon's figures are not representations, but apparitions of the body. The mangled flesh manifested and materialized through its pictorial depiction and through the textural erotics of paint itself. Through its refusal to be metaphor or narrative, Bacon's isolated figures reveal and expose the figure itself. The body is resiliently presented as flesh. According to Gilles Deleuze, painting can overcome figuration through two procedures, abstraction and the figural. While abstraction directs itself towards the brain, in opposition, the figural directs itself towards sensation, towards the body. Before we are capable of rationalizing it, we feel it. And it is in this effective process, from work of art to subject, we feel ourselves. In the work of Bacon, his figures transcend representation and evoke pure sensation. In implementing what Deleuze terms the body without organs, these meaty bodies denounce the principal assignation of the body as structured organism, and rather present themselves as unlimited and unrestricted by forms of organization. For Bacon, the figure is not a stable object in space, but rather the figural seeks out intensities or desires that lie beyond the restrictions of the organization of the organs. In other words, Bacon's bodies seek to liberate themselves from the structures of the figurative, or the conception of the body as structure, and rather pursue modes of intensities through their formlessness and violent movement. The materialism of Bacon's bodies do not seek to articulate themselves logically or ideally, but rather appeal to the irrationality of their existence. The formless in Bacon's figures do not seek to transcend or ascend into the realm of knowledge, but rather situate themselves in the debased and the space of non-knowledge, the space obfuscated by the rational and the structural organism of the legible and naturalistic body. Instead, they inhibit the horizontality of the flesh, the body, and the corporeal matter. This is most clearly evident in the way Bacon's bodies seem to almost become liquid. They melt and descend their meaty bits onto the base of the pictorial space and back to the foundation. They reject the verticality of the anatomically correct human body and descend onto the carnal. These bodies do not aspire to be a figure, but rather embody the vitality of flesh itself. Through this embodiment of flesh, violence and the violence of flesh, Bacon's bodies invoke what Bataille would term the sacred. In this light, Bacon's multiple use of the triptych and diptych formats place him directly within the tradition of the religious, and interestingly provided Bataille an understanding of the sacred. In one of his later paintings, triptych inspired by the Orestia of Aeschylus from 1981, Bacon implements the vocabulary of the Christian altarpiece, but instead replaces the carnality of the institutionally sacred with the sacred of the carnal. Propped up on a geometric pedestal, the central debased body is presented as malleable and liquefied. In this way, Bacon's bodies and compositions implement and appropriate the Christian vocabulary of the sacred, and instead impose their base materiality as a potential for a different type of transgression, one that is contingent on their bodies, without the intention of transcending that corporeality. These bodies do not simply exist in space. They perpetually strive towards a forceful vitality in movement and malleability. They reject the static of being and embrace a becoming. It is in this very violence and non-rational dimension of sensation that Bacon's paintings produce an affect between themselves and the viewer. They do not only embody, but also transmit sensation itself. Ultimately, in rejecting the representational, Bacon's figures produce an affect on the nervous system and not the brain. These paintings are not only depictions of bodies, but become bodies themselves, for it is in this possibility to both affect and be affected that Bacon's paintings become a body, become a sensation itself.